All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for gathering from wherever you are around the world for today's seminar on big tech and digital economy. More specifically, we're going to have Nicolas Petit's well-timed book that introduces this very interesting new concept, the Moligopoly, or he will explain to us how it's pronounced properly, to improve our understanding of digital platforms in general and antitrust and economic regulation in particular. So for this first session, Nicolas will give a brief presentation of his book, and it'll be followed by commentary by David Teece and Doug Melamed and Richard Epstein. And then we'll take a short break and we'll come back from that, and we'll have a 90-minute roundtable where everybody is welcome to participate in the discussion. Besides the people that you see here, we have several master's students and PhD students that really wanted to listen in, and I'm always like to have younger people to listen into these great discussions with such great people here today. So they're listening in the background, but for us, we'll be on the screen, and you'll be able to comment with each other and chat with each other. So on behalf of the Classic Liberal Institute, thanks for coming today. By the way, Nicolas, I just want to say before I let you get going is that I very much enjoyed your interdisciplinary effort. You know, there's a lot I would like to say, but as a good kind of moderator today, I'll try to stay in the background. I just want to say that I appreciated your effort to try to improve our theoretical toolbox around policies to enhance the wealth and welfare in society. And I'm looking forward to hear everybody's thoughts today on Nicolas's ideas and how this relates to this bigger topic that's obviously very, very much front and center these days.
Okay, should we begin? Look, I just say one word, and Adam, I think, will say the same thing, which is on behalf of TIP, I'd like to thank both Bo and Adam for having done such a wonderful job through the CLI under such adverse circumstances. And I think we'll have a great presentation today and a very spirited discussion. So I will now take my accustomed seat in the back of the room, silent, on looking and doing.
The loss of words.
Nicholas, Adam, do you have anything?
I just wanted to say thank you as well to everyone. Bo really deserves all the credit for organizing this particular event, which is a tremendous event. Thank you to Nicolas for writing a fantastic monograph. And really excited to have you join us, and as we can continue what I think is really fantastic programming through the TIP program at CLI. So really looking forward to this afternoon.
Great, and thanks, John, for helping with everything, putting everything together. So, Nicolas, the floor is yours when you're ready.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone here. Special thanks to Richard, Adam, and Bo for convening an event around my book. I'm also very happy that we can have here around the table, or the virtual table, the broad church of competition and regulation, and get away from the sort of tribal disputes that have animated the field in very counterproductive ways in the past years. So let me tell you a little bit about the background behind the book and what's in it. I tried to make it short, but it's never as short as you would like it to be. And a bunch of conclusions relate that to where we can go and what is to do, I think, in the policy work. Okay, so I spent the last 3 years really writing a monograph on the 6 tech giants, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Microsoft, and Apple, firms known as FANGs or GAFAM on this side of the Atlantic. And the intuition behind the book really came in reading daily. The trigger was a disconnect between talks in the tech press about broad-based levels of competition amongst FANGs, lots of value and jobs creation, productivity increases, and intense innovation. And on the other hand, the mainstream press focusing on metrics of tech bigness, monopoly, and conglomeration. Relatedly, and perhaps more importantly, I was very intrigued by the little attention paid to dynamism and the limited interest in the mainstream discussion about the sort of frantic trying and testing and turnaround moves of the big tech firms. In other words, I found really interesting to discuss whether Google had maintained a monopoly market share for more than 10 years, but I found equally interesting to discuss whether Google today was the same firm as 10 years ago. And so these shortcuts in the policy conversation led me to dig deeper. I'm quite a curious person in general, and trained as a lawyer and maybe retrained as a sort of autodidact amateur economist. I really approached the issue as an ignorant, or if you wanted to say that more elegantly, you'd say as an impartial spectator or behind the veil of ignorance. So I did, what lots of people in my field do. You just, you go to Google Scholar if you use a big tech product, or you go to Westlaw and you try to look into the specialist literature and see what's there. And so I did that, and I learned very little. So on the one hand, we could see a new movement, self-dubbed neo-Brandeis, offering a lot of hope, including a re-examination of the established orthodoxy. But hope quickly seized way to despair. The neo-Brandeisian discourse offered little more than a regurgitating past anti-monopoly, big is bad, simplicities, political polarization, funky history, low and imprecise elaboration, and to some extent, some double standards in terms of how to engage in the conversation. More importantly, as I wrote with Doug Melamed in a paper 2 years ago, the neo-Brandeisian movement refuses to acknowledge the constraints of realism, in particular those bearing on the administrative and judicial implementation of the law, the requirements of evidence-based enforcement, and the necessary limits to executive, legislative, and judicial intervention and discretion that a consumer welfare and oriented antitrust law has to offer. So on the other hand, I have to say that I also stumbled on a good bunch of known and predictable set of theory-based efficiency possibility axioms, unable to account for the possibility of empirical change introduced by the nature of new technologies, unable to understand what Hayek would call emergent order. And so my readings really left me in crass ignorance. So as I found myself in this sort of sterile, what I found to be a sterile environment, and I could not dig deeper, I said to myself, I'm gonna go broader. And as government expert reports kept piling up saying we need more enforcement, and nurturing the sort of big is bad with more nuances, but yet, driving the train of regulation forward, I thought to myself, I need to dig broader. And since I try not to be a dilettante, I know if you say that this way in English, but in French it sounds really good, dilettante. I decided to go for a wider factual inquiry of other sources and to lay down a hypothesis that I call the Moligopoly Hypothesis. So in 1942, Joseph Schumpeter writes about the possibility of competition without competitors. And the Moligopoly Hypothesis builds on this deep idea. It suggests or tries to test whether the press and the mainstream neglects or blindness to levels of big tech competition that you hear in other forums it tries to understand whether that blindness is not the result of ideology, but more the result of methodology. And the possibility and the hypothesis is that if this is the result of methodology, experts from other fields, when they look at big tech, might not be talking about monopoly, but about something else. So the inquiry was to see whether I could test the hypothesis that this is a byproduct of methodology, and by going to other sources, whether experts, not laypersons, would come up with a different understanding and a different measure and a different diagnosis of the competitive forces at play in the digital economy. So to operationalize the test, that's a very hard word to say for a non-Englishman, I've assembled a data set of all the yearly filings of the big tech firms to the Securities and Exchange Commission, complemented by company profiles and industry competitor analysis from 17 vendors of market research, business intelligence, and competitive analysis firms. So the data sets shows three things. One, the coexistence of structural monopoly positions with what other people call cognitive oligopoly. 10Ks and markets research call attention to latent and broad levels of competition perceived by FANG firms, but not seen in market share and structural analysis. Two, there is substantial heterogeneity between FANG firms. The spider charts that you can see on this slide show you that some firms seem to take more competition from other FANGs than others. The most spread out graphs that you can see here denote firms exposed to a lot of inter-FANG competition. The less spread out spider chart that you can see here denotes lesser competition, lesser inter-FANG competition on each firm. Right, and three, from a qualitative standpoint, 6 patterns or regularities seemed to arise from my analysis of the data. And again, when I talk about regularities, I'm not talking about universal properties. I'm just talking about average tendency that can vary at firm level. But nonetheless, you can track them in a regular way throughout the document that I've gone through. So these features are the following: diversification. So we can see when we look at the FANGs, a resurgence of conglomeralism compatible with David Teece's early observations of both economies of scope and environments of weak appropriability institutions in digital markets. And you may add to that that the trajectory of diversification of the FANG firms is a response to a dilemma. Digital information is at the same time distributed with wide numbers of users, but at the same time requires a lot of centralization to compute and infer knowledge from the data and create value. So the difficult equation for a big tech firm is to both possess the sensors that will allow, or to control the sensor that will allow the capture of distributed data, but also control the centralized resources that will allow to compute and make sense of the data. So that's where you see diversification in things, what I call sensors. These are devices like, of course, handsets, but also smartwatches, wearable glasses, and maybe driverless cars in the future. And at the same time, investments in infrastructure, centralized technology like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, programming language, you name it. The second feature is discontinuity. So changes, this denotes changes, events or shifts which basically change the competitive environment by reallocating strategic advantages and disadvantages between firms. And technology, and in particular, again, digital information, plays a key role here because it's very modular. So the point here is that digital designs tend to be in a state of constant flux because they can be arranged and rearranged at will to create new form factors and new value propositions. So if the saying is big data is the new oil, I prefer the saying big data is the new Lego, leading to a lot of uncertainty. 3, long-termism. We can see substantial investments in R&D and large cash reserves accumulated by big tech firms, suggesting a long-term horizon, which actually works in tandem with the risk mitigation strategy that you can try to implement in an environment of deep uncertainty and discontinuity. 4th, growth. The behavior of big tech of some big tech economic actors seems to be goal oriented, as standard economics would suggest, but it's not. It doesn't seem to be strictly and exclusively about the sort of first order profit maximization targets. And a richer pattern would include efforts of some actors, but not all of them, to engage into problem-solving activity to try to find new ways to do things better, or to find new ways to do things that seem promising. And so, I often refer to that or think about that in terms of the sort of, engineers' mindsets. You want to solve stuff. And my discussions when I was at Hoover 2 years ago with people in the Valley was really suggesting that, people think a lot about in terms of, let's just, we're clever. Let's try to solve this. 5th, exploration. Big tech firms display ambidexterity, meaning that they allocate substantial resources to innovation that is not goal-oriented, but rather that is blue sky, that is more random, that is more serendipitous. And you can see that in I made a bunch of observations that denote that. And, things like, for instance, the existence of intense internal competition within these organizations between divisional segments or units or products, like Google has Waze and Maps, Microsoft has Skype and Teams, Facebook has Messenger and WhatsApp, and they all tend to attract a lot of budgets, and they compete against each other to some extent, at least for the attention of users. And 6th, flexibility. So contrary to the conventional wisdom of organizational inertia within monopoly firms, the best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life, as we hear often. You see in some of these firms a lot of pivot flexibility, repurposing, strategy changes, and you can really track that. I mean, Microsoft is a sort of paradigmic example as a firm who was just sort of kept and reforming itself, trying to change in the past decade or more. And flexibility might be something that allows competitive advantage, in particular when you move late to a market by being still in the game. Anyway, so with these 6 features in mind, I asked myself a pretty hard question for, again, an amateur economist. And the question was, can we theorize a game of Moligopoly competition where these 6 features are present? And I tried to do that in the book and offer a framework. The framework being that, one, you have to start with the idea that these firms clearly enjoy a monopoly in their origins markets. That's Google in search and Facebook in social networks. But at the same time, these players operate as if they're in sort of dynamic oligopoly game in a multitudinous number of markets. Examples are payments, messaging, streaming video, productivity applications, hardware tablets, cloud computing, driverless cars, smartwatches, artificial reality, virtual reality, and so on. And the number, I mean, if you look if you look the documents, there's a lot of these other markets there. And so what ties these two forces together or makes them dependent one upon the other is that digital information, data lakes, big data, data infrastructure, and so on work together in this monopoly and oligopoly, monopoly and oligopoly ecosystems. And in particular, the sort of recombinant nature of digital technology mean that these tech firms operate under a threat of discontinuity risk on their monopoly positions in the origins market. So the idea that if home assistance is a killing application in the future, doing search on a keyboard no longer has much value as a sort of monopoly product. And these firms, because data allows a sort of not infinite but indeterminate number of recombination possibilities with indeterminate payoffs, they have to engage into that competition. The problem being that this oligopoly competition is to some extent a set of finite games, because increasing returns, network effects, and so increasing returns on the demand and supply side. So that's increase in marginal benefits and decrease in marginal cost. They tend to lead to these sort of very lumpy conditions where you have winner takes all effect and so on and so forth. And so if you lose the game, you're out. So there's this sort of constant incentive on these big tech firms to partake in that oligopoly competition, which is a set of finite games, which might represent some terminal risk for some of them. And that creates intense entry patterns into market that have not yet tipped, market that are still oligopoly. And that explains all this uncertainty, all this cheating, and all this activity. Now, it's sort of standard prisoner's dilemma theory here. Now, what are the bottom lines from that? So from a descriptive standpoint, we see that economic forces discounted in received theory seem to produce incentives on monopoly firms with a monopoly position to compete by indirect entry in untipped markets when they understand that their monopoly rents might be under pressure. And when successful, the observed outcome is one of big tech diversification and reconfiguration of channels of competition. So, for instance, you could think that today Amazon and Apple are much closer competitors than they were 10 years ago, because both invest a lot of money into video content. And that was not the case 10 years ago. Now, from a normative standpoint, some big tech firms display a very high degree of effort, investments, and innovation compared to the standard prediction of monopoly models. And given the widespread spillovers of R&D, hiring expenditure, returns to education, employment prospects, and so on and so forth, ecosystem leadership, given the very high spillovers, this type of competition you might want to encourage more than discourage with the policy-making levers. Okay, so the next question, and I deal quite a lot with that in chapter 5 of the book, are the implications for antitrust policy. So I won't be too detailed here during the talk on that, because it's really wonky antitrust stuff. But the suggestion in the book is that enforcement resources should be channeled towards trying to maintain pressure on markets that have tipped. So the firms with a stable and durable monopoly position in a tipped market remain under the pressure to actually try and test in these other untipped markets. And when that pressure disappears, for some reason, some firms do not display a high degree of effort. This is where I think antitrust should go and look into. So of course, the way antitrust does that traditionally is to try to inject, okay, antitrust is a prescriptive set of rules, but the philosophy is a rivalry-driven philosophy where you try to maintain rivalry as a way to generate consumer welfare enhancing outcomes. And I think this logic is is counterproductive in these markets because you are actually losing the efficiency of the single supplier market share. And so one way to, rather than trying to inject rivalry in these markets, one way, which is what the current policy tries to do in Europe and maybe one day in the US, a better way is probably to try to put pressure on the monopoly rents. And I suggest some sort of use of multi-sided market theory to do that in the book, but I don't want to talk about that now. I can talk about that later in the chat if you want to focus on that. Okay, and so at the same time, I think that's a very strong policy recommendation in the book, and one that, you know, a lot of people might give me some pushback for, is to relax the antitrust doctrine in areas in which you observe entry by the incumbent firm in an untipped market. So if you see leveraging, for instance, this should be a lesser concern in this market than maybe in other markets, because you know, for a bunch of reasons that I explained here, but there's no determinant relationship between losses in consumer welfare and leveraging, and you really cannot see that in digital markets. I mean, the evidence that we have is extremely ambiguous, and if the untipped markets are, you know, the way to go for all the spillovers and so on and so forth, then there are actually very good reasons to try to promote that. Okay, so the type of antitrust rule that I propose in the book have implications and ramifications in both old and ongoing cases. You can see illustration, so not really illustrations of what I propose, because I mean, these cases are, some cases are very old and could not possibly draw inspiration from a theory of multi-sided market that came decades later. But some cases seem to be quite well decided if we look in retrospect, like broadcast music BMI versus CBS. And I think my theory also has implications for ongoing cases, including Epic versus Apple, these sort of headline-grabbing disputes that arose in the summer before the U.S. courts, and also in Brussels before DG competition. All right. So of course, my theory sort of works on a basic distinction between tipped and untipped markets, and this is also an area in which some people might say that the problems are not conceptual, but the problems are operational. So some, you know, people might say, we know how to measure a market share, but we don't know how to say whether a market has tipped or has not tipped. And I think this is true. We're still trying to develop the tools to understand that, but it's not a dispositive objection. In particular, if you read the literature on tipped and untipped markets, there is, in much of the work that has gone into these questions, there is a suggestion that the distinction between a tipped and an untipped market is not a question of market structure, but is a question of market performance, and especially performance at the firm level. So what happens in a tipped market is that incentives to engage in efforts, in investments, to satisfy customers, to refine your products disappears, because the lumpy properties of demand and network effects mean that users will join the platform whatever you do, regardless of your degree of effort. This is what Jean Tirole, Nobel Prize in Economics in 2015, calls, not related to that problem, but to other demand problems, calls lucky demand conditions. When you're above the tipping point, the firm that's reached the tipping point enjoys some sort of lucky demand conditions. Whatever it does, the user base will keep growing. And I think we can look into that deeper, and agencies in particular can look into that deeper by going and asking for divisional data, disaggregate data on R&D, employment, and marketing. Okay, so competition policy for the digital economy, the way forward. What competition policy does today is focus on the green area here on the left-hand side, on the down left-hand side of the graph here. So it focuses on trying to promote competition promote actual competition in markets, competition between substitute products, more or less substitute products. And it believes that this is the way competition operates, and it believes that from a normative standpoint, this is the way competition in markets should operate. It feels to me that competition in dynamic industries like digital operates differently as a sort of standard state and should operate this way. And in particular, it operates with what people like David Teece and others call dynamic competition by innovation, technology, or indirect entry, meaning firms try to focus on mid to long-term efforts, trying to differentiate, produce complements or new combinations. And so I think our work should be to try to move the needle towards a new software of competition that tries to promote that kind of competition, that kind of green area here. Now, way forward, to do that, we need a longer-term consumer welfare standard. To do that, we need to acknowledge the role of dynamic capabilities in the competitive process. We also need to make more space to the role of managers, owners, and entrepreneurs in the success and demise of business organizations. And we might need a broader unit of analysis, not one that deals with firms, but one that deals with ecosystems of multiple firms working together and against each other to compete across markets. So of course, not all is great with big tech. We heard about fake news, we heard about hate speech, we heard about political polarization, but these are not market power related issues. And there's very good reason why antitrust should focus on serving consumers, not all sorts of, not a laundry list of political demands. I discussed that in chapter 6 of the book, but I didn't intend to discuss this today because this will just lead to an endless discussion. So anyway, I'm very happy that I had the chance to present today, and I hope that you like the book. OUP told me it's out of print already. I don't know if that's a problem with the price, maybe the price too low, but at $90, I don't think they did that. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's been a sort of lucky demand spike with the congressional report on big tech in the US a few weeks ago. So shifting the demand curve, movements along the demand curve, I don't know. But anyway, the book will be reprinted. They promised me, and it should be out. The second print should be out very soon. Thank you for your attention.
You're writing a book about the digital economy, and you're producing these strange, funny physical books. You should have gone straight to digital. We wouldn't have had a demand, or we wouldn't have had a supply issue, right? David, are you ready?
Yes, I am. I do have some slides, and my assistant is putting those up. But while she's doing that, let me say, first of all, a big thank you to all of you, and in particular for Nicolas and for his contribution here. What I think we have with the Moligopoly theory is, I think, a very fulsome description of dynamic competition and how it works. And this, sadly, is substantially absent from the debate around antitrust in big tech. And the fact that we are to the point, at least in Europe and the United States possibly as well, of intervening in these markets where we don't really understand the nature of competition. We don't understand what Nicolas referred to as various ecologies of competition, is a real sad statement about the state of our analytical abilities and our ability to get people to understand what's really going on. So at a high level, I see Moligopoly as sort of fitting into this area of dynamic competition. Schumpeter kicked us off in that direction years ago, but it was an inconvenience for most of my colleagues in the economics profession because it couldn't be modeled very well. And so, in fact, it was abandoned and never worked on. And I think we're paying the price now of ignoring Schumpeter and the role of innovation in competition. So that is my starting point here. And Nicolas has given us not just food for thought, he's given us a lot of useful ideas that are, close to being operational, or at least moving in that right direction. So let me back up a little bit here with my slides and sort of try and fit Nicolas's work onto this broader canvas. Next, please, Caroline. So first of all, I don't need to remind people on this webinar about Schumpeter and what he said. But in essence, what he said was the competition that really matters. If you're really pro-competition, you should be pro-innovation. Most of the competition folks out there see competition as driving innovation, and indeed it does. But there's almost nothing. You take a look at Jonathan Baker's recent book on antitrust, there's almost nothing about how innovation drives competition. And how can one possibly formulate policy about antitrust and regulation without understanding how innovation drives competition? So what we've collapsed on is what I call static competition. And it's basically weak T compared to the kind of competition that's driven by innovation. So the probability we're going to make serious policy mistakes is very high when the kind of competition we're favoring is the weak version rather than the strong version. Now, next slide, please. So we need new frameworks. In fact, I would posit that the reason why the neo-Brandeisians have gotten as far as they have is because the mainstream has actually done a poor job of dealing with innovation. And whenever there's a vacuum, whenever there's a set of issues and there's not a good scholarly research base to address them, it's into those vacuums that people like the neo-Brandeisians step in with theories from the past. And I've been saying this for 30 years. Great contribution of the Chicago school was to get economics into competition policy. The problem is they got the wrong type of economics in. They got static microtheory. The whole innovation story is out of it. And you go read Posner, Easterbrook, and Bork. Innovation's a nuisance to them a good deal of the time. And it's a nuisance because you can't use the static, simple, or even complex microtheory models. You can't use an equilibrium approach. Thanks to Nicolas, my colleague, George Akerlof here at Berkeley, I think gives us one explanation for this as once we had economics into industrial organization or industrial organization into antitrust in a major way, the hardness police have come in and required that we model things as formally as possible, and all the kudos go to those that have the tightest models. And of course, many of my colleagues at Berkeley fit into this category. And what that's done is essentially squeeze out an understanding of complex phenomena. The next slide, please. This is my adaptation of George Akerlof's diagram. This is a very important paper, in my view, in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2020, where he points out that there's a trade-off in economic science, if you will, or economic analysis between hardness or formalism and importance. And the more you focus on hardness and getting the model right, your ability to attack important problems declines. And so most of received mainstream industrial organization and antitrust sits over there under static competition, where you can, come up with equilibrium models and you can show your analytical skills and prove theorems and receive the accolades of your colleagues. Whereas dynamic competition is up on the top left there, because dynamic competition is about disequilibrium, and a lot of the formal methodologies of economics and the modeling that's favored just can't be used quite as readily. That's not to say economics isn't relevant. It's highly relevant, but it's innovation economics that you need, not the sort of Marshallian static models that, or even in modern adaptations of them, which are really from the industrial age. Next slide, please. So, so the problem here is the dynamic competition notion having been left on the shelf for too long. A very small group of people, I'd like to include myself in that category, have tried to move the ball forward. But essentially, the audience for dynamic competition until very recently, has been no more than 20 scholars in the whole world, whereas there's probably 20,000 scholars that are busily out there trying to do what I call static competition and static analysis. The result is the condition that we're in today. And the result is that people are falling back to models of railroads and oil trusts of the past to explain what Amazon and Apple and Google are all about. And quite frankly, it's not even sophomoric, it's something worse than that, to come at the complex phenomena we see using models from the past. Next, please. Another problem, which I think we have to deal with, is in order to simplify life, antitrust walled itself off from industrial policy and technology policy. Dealing with industrial policy and competitiveness, if you will, has been anathema to the field of industrial organization. And of course, the reason it's anathema is that it complicates things, but we have active industrial policies, particularly in Europe. We have industrial policy in the United States, although we don't call it that. And we need frameworks that can actually bring these together, because if we don't have some amount of harmony, when our economic, even if we get antitrust policy somewhat correct, it's going to be undone by industrial policy and technology policy and vice versa. So we need a framework that is broad enough to embrace that. And I think Nicolas's work on Moligopoly and the general area of dynamic, or the general focus on dynamic competition, can actually provide an umbrella for bringing these areas together. Next, please. So what are the building blocks for this third way, if you will? There's many elements of Moligopoly that I find attractive. I think the fact that it emphasizes broad spectrum competition is relevant, not only for relevant market analysis, but also to understand the competitive dynamics, or the ecologies of competition, as Nicolas calls it. Another building block I think we need is to broaden consumer welfare, to not abandon it, but put a long-term focus on it. The reality is that for convenience and analytical simplicity, the agencies have adopted a 1 or 2 year view of consumer welfare, which has really played into the hands was played against innovation. Innovation and the effects of innovation on competition usually take longer than that to play out. Nicolas was kind enough to mention dynamic capabilities. I mean, essentially management's been read out of antitrust economics. It's been read out of competition theory, but clearly management matters. And markets that may look like they're tipped to somebody, to a different management team, may not look quite as tipped. And Andy Grove once said that with respect to Intel, that all you have when you have a dominant position is a seat at the table for the next round of innovation. And somebody pretty damn clever got to be sitting in that seat. And if you get it wrong, you're out of the game. So the sort of structuralist view of all of this, I think, has to be tempered with recognition, not just of uncertainty, but recognition that management matters. Also, antitrust scholars need to distinguish between, and Moligopoly theory doesn't quite do it yet, but I think the foundations are there, between rents that are Schumpeterian, Ricardian, and naked monopoly rents. To me, it's just astounding that antitrust has gone as far as it has, talking about monopoly rents without thinking about the source of those rents. Clearly, if it's a return to innovation, you're more comfortable with it. than if it's not. If it's a return to scarcity, one from a policy point of view should be more comfortable with it. That's of course Ricardian rents. But if it's just due to naked monopoly and exclusionary behavior that has no other merit, then that's the type of profits that one should be concerned about. So at least conceptually, we should have these distinctions in mind. The fact that we've gone as far as we have for 100 years in antitrust without making these distinctions is a statement of the pathetic nature of scholarship. Also, we need to rethink the notions of potential competition, and I think Moligopoly theory is a start in that direction. But you know, how can we figure out the strength of competition without having a theory of potential competition? Of course, the reason we don't have a theory of potential competition is we don't have a theory of capabilities. So you get an Instagram circumstance where you know, we don't know how to calibrate competition until there's some type of market share metric to put on the table. What a ridiculous and pathetic state of affairs. Also, the theory of complements is barely getting off the ground, even though there's a long history. If you go back in economics to complements, it's largely absent from a good deal of antitrust and competition policy work. So these are some of the gaps that I see that Moligopoly theory is boldly starting to contribute to. And once again, I congratulate Nicolas for blasting into this territory. And he doesn't have to get it all right. He just has to show that there is some useful insights. And I believe he's done that. And hopefully more will come in behind. Next, please. You know, I find perhaps the most powerful aspect of Moligopoly, this sort of notion of broad spectrum competition. Antitrust is so much thinking about relevant markets as if they're segregated from each other. And that's because, you know, we use market share as a proxy for the strength of a firm. What a ridiculous notion. You know, and I come from the field of strategic management where we think about capabilities as a proxy for the strength of a firm. And the market share is just a, you know, a temporary manifestation of those capabilities. But yet for 100 years, we're focused on market share as a measure of market power or power without challenge. I mean, what's wrong with the academy that we couldn't do that? And I think this notion of broad spectrum competition causes you to look upstream to see what the source of competitive advantage is. And it's not just network effects. It's not just economies of scale. It's around data and what I call data orchestration. And this is a major contribution, I believe, of Moligopoly theory, is that it's focusing in ways that others have not on the role of data and the relevance of that data across multiple domains. Next, please. Next slide, please. You know, we've got a good understanding of multi-sided markets, and a lot of us, a lot of my economic friends are busily trying to understand big tech by, you know, formulating it as in platform terms. And yes, indeed, there are insights from that. Another group is focusing on modularization, and there's useful insights from that. But it's not just about platforms. It's not just about modularization. It's about data orchestration. And that is where I think Nicolas has put a third peg in the ground. And there's very little attention given to C compared to A and B. And of course, A and B is already in the comfort zone of most economists. And so they tend to stay in their comfort zone rather than looking for where the issues really are and where the insights really are. And Nicolas has, I think, really done an excellent job in highlighting the role of big data here. Next, please. There needs to be a new focus in understanding innovation and innovation flowing from collecting, storing, and using data. There's hundreds of little anecdotes about Toyota, for instance, using GPS data to provide new services. There's hundreds of anecdotes about new data being generated as a result of sensors and the proliferation of the Internet of Things. So while the idea of big data is thrown around, very few people are thinking about how that animates competition and how it leads to multi-spectrum or broad spectrum innovation and competition in quite surprising areas. Next, please. Of course, there is some focus on big data and pressure now to make that data available by license or by some other method to competitors. But I think there also needs to be a realization that raw behavioral data is of little value. It becomes valuable after the application of filtering, after the application of artificial intelligence, after the application of other technologies that enable insights to be gleaned and services to be developed. Next, please. So this big data is also what's driving innovation. Well, should I say it's activity, algorithmic and otherwise, on top of big data, which is driving innovation. Machine learning is coming into play, as well as insights from econometric and other forms of analysis. Next, please. Now, these are just possibilities. There's no inexorable connection between big data. Just because I got big data doesn't mean that I'm got a competitive advantage. It's only if I can develop strong dynamic capabilities to collect, organize, and orchestrate this data that it becomes valuable. And I think this is where a lot of people looking at big data really miss or don't understand the contribution of big tech. If big tech loses its skill or slips behind in AI and related things, they're going to slip behind in the marketplace and in the ability to develop new services and new products. Next, please. So let me just sort of summarize this point because it's an important one and it's, I think, central to the Moligopoly story. So data orchestration is a capability beyond that of afforded by platforms and complementary assets. It's capability that's not ubiquitous. It has to be built up over time. You can't buy this capability, you have to build it. It crosses industry boundaries as well as market boundaries. So traditional notions of relevant market and so forth get challenged. The arrival of the Internet of Things is just causing this to explode in new and different ways, leading to, as Nicolas says, different ecologies of competition. And then secondly, successful data orchestrators really are those that maintain a semi-exclusive implicit contractual relationship with customers. It's the exhaust fumes of customer transactions that yield a lot of this data, and maintaining stability in customer relationships is an important element of competitive advantage. Next, please. It's also my view, and I think it's implicit in Moligopoly theory, that platforms that do not innovate can and will be overtaken. I'm not as, this tipping point language has become so common now, but to me, it's not about the size of the platform alone. It's about who the heck is managing it. Because I come from a school of business, I suppose, I do think that management matters. Otherwise, we shouldn't have schools of business. But the literature treats a lot of this stuff is being inexorable. But, you know, I always go back to Andy Grove, that the life of even if you're a monopolist, is not an easy life. The title of Andy's book was Only the Paranoid Survive. So traditional antitrust, you know, often imputes monopoly. And when the managers of those companies say that only the paranoid survive, they're not doing that for public relations reasons. They're doing that because that's the reality. So there's something wrong. Either people like Andy Grove are lying through their teeth, or there's something wrong with our theories. And I'm willing to bet the latter rather than the former. Next, please. So look, because we've been so slow out the gate on all of this stuff, we've been sitting on our hands. The profession's been sitting on its hands for 50 years. That's why the Brandeisians are out in front. You know, our job is to limit the damage that's coming from regulatory interventions and antitrust interventions. I think the notion that we can do much more than that, and I'm not normally a pessimistic person, but I feel that way. So what can we push? We can push respect for property rights, including right to own data. We can recognize that data is valuable only once it's filtered and organized. We should always be favoring innovation, put innovation first. A lot of the people that are complaining about the state of the world are not consumers, they're competitors, and many of them are Me Too imitators. They're not innovators, and they're not contributing to competition in any fundamental way. But traditional antitrust, which counts competition by head counting, the number of players in the market and market shares and things like that, you know, they're missing the boat, but we have to keep driving away at the fact that favor innovation if you really want to favor competition. So incumbents shouldn't be given a helping hand. If indeed there is regulation that comes and if data has to be licensed, then for heaven's sake, make sure it's done so at at a competitive price. I think that's my last slide, Caroline. Is there one more? Okay. I think go with the last slide if that's not it. Yeah. Well, you know, Europe's out in front, and I found this quote. You know, I used to, when I was in graduate school, I read this book by Jean-Jacques Sylvain-Scobert, where Europe was bristling in the 60s because of American investment, and companies like General Motors and IBM were entering the European market, much like big tech has entered the European market today. And what Sylvain-Scobert said was that Europe needs is the ability to transform an idea into reality through the talented coordinating skills and making rigid organizations flexible. So Europe needs stronger dynamic capabilities, and the companies that are wailing about Amazon, Apple, and Google also need to check to make sure that their dynamic capabilities are in top form as well, and very often pointing fingers at another company as a substitute for doubling down and being innovative. So let me just end by saying I hope that what we have here is Moligopoly, as well as a set of other related ideas, in forming a new framework of dynamic competition, which can be put out there to inform not just a policy debate, but also enforcement with respect to emerging antitrust issues.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. When I first started to learn economics in a serious way, starting with a course on Schumpeter, so I never understood why everything you said wasn't just completely obvious. So, but I'm not sure that's the normal way of studying economics in the world. But I won't take up any more time. Doug Melamed, are you ready, Doug?
I'm all set, yeah.
Do you have a presentation?
I do not have slides, it'll just be,
okay.
just be me. you know, you can't do good government policy in any field. You certainly can't do it in competition law unless you understand the facts with great accuracy and insight and so forth. And Nicolas' new book, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful and valuable aid to all of us in understanding the facts. The caricature of a big tech firm as an enduring monopoly because it's been that way forever, without realizing, as anybody who knows folks who work at Google, for example, realize how much time and energy and anxiety they spend innovating and not just trying to protect their existing franchises, but imagine ways to use their human and data resources, new ways to use them, to create value and so on. You have to understand that in order to do sensible government policy. And I think Nicolas' book is chock full of good insights and understanding and pulls together a lot of data. And it's a very, very valuable contribution. And David's comments, for the most part, I mean, at a high level, I certainly agree with the importance of innovation and some of the shortcomings of other people's perceptions and analyses in this area. I think there is some truth to what he called the hardness police, although leaving aside the issues in the economics discipline of whether you have to show your prodigious analytical or mathematical skills in order to get tenure, which is a intra-economics problem. I want to say in partial, maybe 10% justification of the hardness police, that if you're going to have government intervention into the economy, you have to know with some precision what the facts of the individual case are. So the quest for tools that enable you to understand those facts with some precision, some care, as opposed to simply painting with a broad brush, using generally correct intuitions to solve very specific cases, I think is not one that we should just cast aside with epithets. I do want to say one thing, though. I mean, there are a lot of things David said about antitrust law that I disagree with that would be implicit in what's to follow. But one thing in particular I want to pause about is the implication, I think, in what David was saying, that entry barriers are not all that important. And he told the story of Yahoo being overtaken after it had overtaken someone else. That wasn't one I've heard, but I've heard a million variations on that theme. One of the interesting things I've observed kind of anecdotally, that is, I haven't studied this systematically, but I think it's true, is that if you look at the duration of one firm's dominance before it is supplanted by a new firm that does it better or changes the paradigm in some way, those durations seem to be consistently increasing, right? From VisiCalc to Lotus 1, 2, 3 to Excel, from whatever that first word processing thing, I remember it's called now, to WordPerfect to Word, and now Google after Yahoo. And I think the reason for that is not just network effects, it's penetration. Because if the new entrant not only has to find a number of users sufficient to meet network effects requirements, but has to convince a lot of existing users who've sunk costs in a particular technology to change, it's harder to do that. And I don't think we can dismiss those kinds of entry barrier problems. Okay, more important, at least more relevant to my competence. Where I get off the parade here a little bit is on the question of what are the implications of all of this for legal doctrine. The implications of what David and Nicolas have said for understanding the facts in any policy question are enormous. But I want to focus on what they are for antitrust doctrine. The populist left seems to think that antitrust is about attacking big firms. Nicolas says quite explicitly it's about preserving static rivalry. I think there's something to the latter. The former, I think, is wrong, at least for the last 40 or 50 years. I think there's something to Nicolas' perception in Europe, where you have the exploitation offense, And where you see in Article 102, so many of the guidance from the commission says, well, we're going to permit certain kinds of efficient conduct, even if rivals are hurt, except when it eliminates all rivals. I've always assumed there was some notion that you have to keep one hot red ember, you know, in the area if you want to have the hope of reigniting the fire of competition. Whether that made any sense at all, it certainly suggests that Nicolas is probably right in Europe about the focus on preserving extant competition or rivalry. I don't think that accurately describes U.S. antitrust law. It certainly describes the way most people applied in most cases, because naturally drunk economists look for the keys under the light post, and therefore they may be exaggerating focusing too much on that. But conceptually, that's not what antitrust in the United States is about. Antitrust in the United States is about anti-competitive conduct that does not increase welfare. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. And if you engage in that kind of conduct, you can violate the antitrust laws even if there are no existing or even known potential competitors. You can violate the antitrust laws if that kind of conduct raises entry barriers and therefore makes it harder for new innovators to thrive and to flourish, and therefore diminishes innovation and retards dynamic competition. That's what the Microsoft case was all about. And there's another element in addition to anti-competitive conduct, and that is a kind of screen so that we don't turn it into a business tort, antitrust law into a business tort, and that is we're going to prohibit anti-competitive conduct only where it matters, and that is where it materially reduces the discipline of existing or potential of future rivals on the firm. That doesn't strike me as at all inconsistent with a world in which we take full advantage of the insights of Nicolas and David and others who focused on dynamic competition, innovation, and the Moligopoly nature of the tech platforms. Perhaps more important in my where I get pause about some of what's in Nicolas' book is his suggestion that we should have, in effect, a lot of categorical rules. Actually, I saw them at the last couple of slides. I think I saw them in the last couple of slides that David used as well. Category, for example, treat platforms differently. Distinguish between tipped and untipped markets. Permit entry of platforms into untipped markets in almost all circumstances, unless it's part of protecting the platform monopoly. Now, one concern I have about rules like this is that I'm not sure the categories are always so distinct. What's a dominant platform? When's a market tipped? And Nicolas, I think, seems to understand that. He admits that there's a lot of imprecision in those categories. And even if there's not conceptual imprecision, there's going to be difficulty in observing them and identifying them in individual cases. So if you have rules that are based on imprecise categories, you're naturally going to have arbitrary decisions, and the rules will therefore become a very imperfect vehicle for optimal deterrence. And let me say something. Under U.S. antitrust law, which is enforceable by anybody injured by a violation by 52 government entities, by generalist courts, and so on, every kind of business conduct, almost every kind of business conduct, is potentially subject to the antitrust laws. So the importance of the principal importance of the antitrust laws lies not in the outcomes of individual cases, however notorious they might be, but rather in the multitude of anti-competitive acts that are deterred by a sound antitrust law, and in the even larger multitude of pro-competitive acts that are not deterred by an ambiguous or overbroad or unsound antitrust law. So the deterrence thing is really important. But even apart from that question of imprecision, and assuming the correctness of Nicolas' high-level analysis, his policy proposals about antitrust law seem to me to raise two related questions. The first is, why do we create what in our would be in effect safe harbors for conduct that would be regarded as anti-competitive, unlawful, and unlawful under U.S. antitrust law. Let's take an example. Suppose Amazon enters into an adjacent market, a product market. It decides to go into the widget business. And I completely agree, by the way, said this many times. If it is using lawfully obtained data, aggregated with other lawfully obtained data, and it enables it to build a better widget, that's efficiency and it should be applauded. But let's suppose it enters into that market by predatory pricing. I have no reason to think it's done that, by the way, Lena Khan notwithstanding, but let's suppose it does. Why on earth, and it has nothing to do with protecting its platform monopoly. Why on earth would we tolerate that? Why wouldn't we want to have antitrust say, look, I want to have a competition freed from those kinds of anti-competitive acts so that the most efficient rival, the better innovator can be the one that wins, not the one best able or most willing to engage in anti-competitive conduct. But the second concern I have about some of these rules is inherent in the idea of a rule-based antitrust law in the first place. Now, if you have rules that say, well, certain kinds of conduct are okay if they're engaged in by certain firms and not by other firms, then we necessarily have the question of, have the rules been properly specified? And I'm going to submit to you that they will never be properly specified. They will never track precisely to the economic welfare objectives we have in mind. They're going to be over-inclusive in some ways, under-inclusive in others. I gave you an example of one that might be under-inclusive. So you're going to have what I call specification errors. And those errors will increase over time, I believe, because rules always become kind of ossified. They don't adapt to new learning and to new understanding. They are the subject of industry capture. There are transaction cost reasons why they don't get ossified, and there are inertia reasons. So the specification errors will grow over time. Now, U.S. antitrust law is, I'm going to overstate this, but certainly at a conceptual level, what I'm about to say, I believe is correct. It is not rule-based, it is principle-based. In fact, I think I can tell you what U.S. antitrust law means conceptually in one sentence. It means this: conduct that weakens the discipline of rivals and does not increase product quality, reduce costs, or reduce above cost prices is illegal. Period. Now, what does that say? It says if you're engaging in conduct that doesn't increase welfare and the effect is materially to impact the ability of rivals to discipline your conduct, you violated the antitrust laws. That maps very closely to the normative objective of maximizing both dynamic and static economic welfare. Very little specification error cost in that principle. The problem with U.S. antitrust law are what I call application errors. You make mistakes in applying them. We see it every day. We see the Supreme Court in the stunningly ignorant and ideological American Express case. We see the Qualcomm decision. And there are mistakes, by the way, in which plaintiffs have won where they shouldn't have won as well. So the question then is, what's likely to be a greater source of error costs? Misapplication of sound principles or application of rules? And that raises the question, are the sum of specification errors plus the application errors inherent in applying those rules to the individual case, especially if defining a tip market is itself an uncertain exercise, is that aggregate going to increase the cost of application errors in a principle-based antitrust? I think they are likely to. One reason is that specification errors apply not just to the case at hand, but to all commerce, because everybody's going to be looking at the rules and saying, I have to conform my conduct to the standards of the rules. Unless application errors are predictable and systematic, they're likely to affect just the case in front of the court. So, bottom line, I think Nicolas' book is wonderful. I've learned a great deal about it. I think others will learn a great deal about it. It's not the final word, but it's a very valuable word. I think David is right about the importance of innovation and that more attention should be paid to it. And the hardness police should find tools that satisfy them and also help address those important dynamic issues. But I think the implications of what Nicolas and David are saying about antitrust law, which is to move away from the current principles into categories and rules, is likely to be a recipe for more error costs, less economic welfare. And that therefore the real value of Nicolas' book is not in his prescription for the law, but in his in the insights he's given us all, and hopefully that can be used to help reduce application errors in the application of U.S. antitrust law.
Thank you very much. Richard, I'm behind schedule. I know you're a man of few words, Richard Epstein.
Well, I will keep to my 15 minutes, all right, and not engage in temporal trespass. Or at least I will try. This is a very large topic, and let me begin what I think is the appropriate question, which is not to essentially talk about dynamic economies first, but to talk about static economies first. And I think the great success that the antitrust law has had in those particular areas is that it can find serious places in which there are resources imbalances through the creation of cartels. And it's pretty confident that under those kinds of circumstances, what you can do is to start to develop various tests about market share, various steps about cooperative and behavior, implicit behaviors on how they go, and you know pretty much what you're doing. When you start trying to get the dynamic markets, I have basically come to the position quite the opposite of I think what David says. I'm about ready to throw in the towel. I mean, I cannot at this particular point think of any really powerful or coherent way that you could use the antitrust laws to advance the particular goals that you want. And so here, let me kind of give a simple sort of statement about this. What happens is when you're trying to figure out in a static market what's going on, you're looking at market shares and existing competitors. When you start to look at dynamic markets, it's the guy whom you do not know who turns out to be the competitor. And it may be multiple parties. It turns out there probably will not be one such competitor. There'll be multiple people who will come in. They're not going to target any one particular firm when they make their innovations. They're going to take a dent out of many multiple firms simultaneously. And so if you try to figure out what the particular market share calculations are going to be, it's going to be extremely difficult to come up with any sense as to how it is you run these measures. So at this particular point in time, what I tend to do is to go back to what I thought to be the general rule of laissez-faire economics. I'm going back to Jacob Viner, but I think that's a perfectly honorable place to go, in which he says that the basic presumption in antitrust law or in any other area is the administrative costs of intervention are always positive. The unanticipated consequences are always there, so that the burden is upon those who wish to impose some kind of discipline on the way in which the system ought to operate is to be able to show fairly clearly the kinds of benefits that you hope to get out of these particular operations. And when I start looking at the way in which the antitrust laws, I could make that characteristic working in the horizontal market with cartels, but there are lots of other areas where I can't. So just to go back again to something which has come up from time to time, there's always the question that David mentioned that you're going to worry about predation in some kind of a world in which somebody could reduce their prices in the short term in order to harvest some gains in the long term. And hard as I try to think about this, it seems to me that unless you hope to be able to get some regulatory advantage in the second period, the strategy of taking losses in the first period will redound as much to your competitors as it will to yourself. Everybody else will take quickly adaptive strategies. And so that the second period in which you're supposed to get the very large payoffs needed to cover the initial cost, it's just not going to be able to arrive. I don't think there's any particular reason why that model, which has been used in markets for tea and markets for opium or whatever else it is that you want to sell, don't apply when you start to deal with long-term markets. Indeed, I would argue that it's exactly the opposite. Since you don't know who it is that is coming in, you don't know exactly what it is that you're trying to exclude or how it is that you're trying to exclude it. So to engage in a systematic situation where you sort of sell goods at below prices doesn't seem to make any sense because there's no real definition of what counts as recoupment. This is one of the things, of course, that I think is an embarrassment to the lean-a-con theories, which get, I think, much too much attention relative to their intrinsic merit. You look at a firm like Amazon, it fails in some markets, which I think is perfectly understandable. There are niche competitors in given places who can do far better than it can. There's no way that you could be the best in all possible worlds. Too much comparative advantage is there. And then also it turns out that the prices are going to be very low, but this particular situation, they're going to turn out to be sustainable. And what you're trying to do is to get a very large consumer base, make relatively small gains with respect to each individual unit, and then to constantly ramp them up by having a very large number of units there. I just don't understand this as some kind of a strategy that you're trying to develop that should count in some deep or improper way as being wholly improper. So the sense that I have is that the predation theories as a potential source of trying to deal with this thing are very much against the odds. David mentioned the Microsoft case and as a situation in which you're trying to figure out how to intervene in order to facilitate entry into a future market. And I think there are a couple of problems that you have with that. Every time you start talking about a particular practice that these companies engage in, you can't make the neat kind of separation that you can with ordinary cartelization and say, aha, this is a restrictive arrangement with no efficiency benefits. All of these technological situations that you go, it turns out that the technology is always embedded in the so-called restrictive practice. And if you decide that you're going to create some kind of a prohibition, it turns out you're killing off good behavior as well as bad behavior, assuming you know what the bad behavior is. And then, of course, there's always the remedial side, generally neglected when you're talking about antitrust laws, and that creates another further magnification of the basic problem. In the aftermath, what Judge Kotar-Catelli did in dealing with this stuff was, very simple. She said, I really want to make sure that everything that is produced by Microsoft is competitive, so I'm going to have some kind of a competitive independent panel review the various kinds of changes it wants to make in its platforms and technology to see if it's going to be compatible with other people who want to hook up to it in the network industry. And IBM knew exactly what the right strategy was. It simply flooded Microsoft with large numbers of kind of possible but not committed innovations and said, you evaluate them all, and then after you've done that, we'll figure out which 2 or 3 of them we want to move. And generally speaking, if you're somebody like Microsoft trying to run a platform economy, your innovations, given competition, are going to last 6 months for a year. If you try to put together an overall system in which the period of review is equal to or longer than the period of the useful life of the innovation in question, what you've done in effect is on the remedial side, create anti-competitive conduct by those people who are supposed to benefit from pro-competitive type situations. I think it's extremely difficult to sort of avoid this situation because when you're dealing with a dynamic game, it's not only the innovator or the dominant party who will engage, if possible, into anti-competitive activities. It turns out that it's going to be the competitors who come in who will try to do exactly the same thing on the other side. So I think it's a mistake to sort of say whether there is or is not a dominant market, that we could always identify one party to this particular arrangement about whom we would say, oh, we have to be extremely careful about what they do, and then to give somebody else in this arrangement a free pass. One of the things I like to say when I teach even an elementary contracts class is that if you spend all of your time in contracts trying to figure out what abuses you have to stop on the part of landlords, and you put all your energy into that particular basket, the number of tenant abuses that will start to arise will be very, very great, because now there's no committed activity in order to stop it on that particular side. So essentially what you have in all of these markets is the two-edged problem. This problem's coming from either side. Kevin Neruzzi and I wrote this piece, which has gotten a little bit of attention in the Berkeley Journal of Law and Technology, dealing with a lot of the bargaining games that come with respect to these essential technologies. And one of the things that we said is that, if you put out there as an outsider, oh, we have to get the prices below a certain level, there's nothing which says that the opportunity takes place by the incumbent. It could take place on the other side of these particular transactions. Holdout problems are perfectly symmetrical. And if you really commit yourself to a view that it's only one guy who's going to be carrying the bad hat and the other guy who's wearing the good cap and so forth, you are going to make a large number of mistakes in the way in which this thing ought to work. So I think once we realize that the multilateral nature of abuse can come at any side of the market at any time under any circumstances, it becomes a mistake to think that the antitrust law is going to start to be able to deal with that. A further problem that comes out of this kind of a situation is trying to figure out exactly what remedies you want. And let me mention here, David, I think, said, and I think quite rightly, that we always have to deal with these neo-Brandeisians. I have to tell you, one of the worst books I've ever read in the history of Western civilization is Brandeis's book, Other People's Business. And one of the best decisions that I've ever seen in the antitrust law was the Brandeis decision in the Chicago trade case. Because in the one case, he put his thinking cap on and managed to find that a decision below, which treated a certain conduct as a per se illegality, was in fact per se legal. So it wasn't that he went from one end to the middle, he went from one end to the other end and did so in a perfectly powerful and persuasive way. But the bigness is bad, and this stuff turns out to be, I think, extremely terrible. And let me give you what I think to be a kind of dangerous prescription that we can have coming out of this. There was a recent article published, or at least in print, by my colleagues Scott Hempel and Tim Wu, and what they're trying to do is to figure out a regime for dealing with nascent competition. And the basic argument that they say is we're so worried about dominant firms in the tech and similar industries that what we have to do is to arrange a particular kind of structure in which we prevent those large dominant firms from acquiring small firms, which in the fullness of time could become their full competitors and to be able to do business against them. And this is exactly the wrong kind of prescription, because it presumes that you have the kind of knowledge which in most cases you never do have. First of all, there is the question of picking winners and losers. Exactly which of these nascent firms are the ones who are going to do well and which of them are not going to do well is subject to very serious kinds of questions. And then it also turns out there's a further problem that is going to come. You could find many companies that are taken over, they turn out to do extremely well, and then you say, gee, wouldn't it be wonderful if they would turn out to be competitors of, rather than subsidiaries of the dominant company in a particular field? Well, there's a huge fallacy in that particular situation. You assume that there's no synergy that took place in the merger, no ability to add capital, to add know-how, to combine intellectual property and so forth. And there's nothing whatsoever to suggest that the firm that was taken over and became successful would not have withered and died on the vine if it had not had all of the stuff that had come in from the other side. So it's extremely dangerous when you see a successful merger to assume, aha, this would have been successful without the merger. If anything, the argument would go in the opposite direction and suggest that the kind of merger that you're going to develop in this case probably did have efficiencies that might not have been able to have been achieved by lesser companies. Does this mean that the market in these areas is perfect? Well, of course not. One of the things I think that we have to understand about antitrust is the same problem that Milton Friedman made a very long time ago. His wonderful observation, he says, you've got an imperfection in the boat, there's a hole on one end. And so he says, what do we have to do? He said, in order to level the boat, you put a hole on the other end, and essentially, therefore, it could sink uniformly. What you really have to do is you have to patch the hole. So when you're starting to figure out why it is that there are too many companies that get acquired, where they might do better on the independent stuff, I think it would be a terrible mistake to prevent the acquisitions by the antitrust laws. That's creating the second hole in the boat. What you really want to do is to take your gaze and to look at the securities markets. And one of the things that you do find out about these security markets is that the ability to have initial public offerings of particular companies is more difficult now than it has ever been before, that the ability to meet all the requirements to getting on exchanges have become much more difficult. And so that what happens is you could get an unjust shift towards acquisition as opposed to going out independently, which has nothing to do with the antitrust laws in the acquisition market. What it has to do is with the securities law dealing with these problems on the other side. And so once you start to figure out that, then the question you have to ask is, what is it you're going to do in order to make these kinds of programs work? What kind of concepts can you start to have? And here's where I'm very uneasy about what Nicolas says. I mean, I agree with him that, and it's a great contribution to constantly show how these markets churn and so forth. But Moligopoly, if it's a firm akin to a monopoly firm behaving like a competitive firm or an oligopolistic firm, that word akin in its definition has to do an awful lot of work. And what it does is it essentially brings rise to the really serious problem. You get a firm which acquires a dominant position through lawful and only lawful activities. Is that, a la Europe, going to be subject to some kind of monopoly regulation? Or is it going to be a la Grinnell in the United States, something that we want to encourage, long-term dynamic efficiency as opposed to that? I'm not really sure what the answer turns out to be, but I don't think the Moligopoly thing starts to get you there. And I feel the same way about the tipping stuff. Now, I hear Doug and I actually agree on something. I think that is, I don't know what is a tipping firm or a tip firm or an untipped firm and so forth, because these firms constantly modify, not only, of course, in their mergers and acquisitions, but the way in which they change their internal business models so that Microsoft, being a failed mainframe computer guy or whatever it used to do with its operating system, becomes a cloud company. And so it is that all things are going on. So if all of these large companies are operating in multiple markets simultaneously, they could be tipping in one, untipped in the other, about to untip in a third. And so to try to focus on the firm, which has diverse operations as though it's a unitary activity, seems to me to be, in these particular cases, a really strong kind of mistake. And so when you want to go on to this thing, where do you end up with what's going on in these particular cases? And I think this is the kind of sober situation that you have, is that when Aaron directly said a very long time ago that laissez-faire is a presumption against government intervention, unless it can be shown to be a good, is going to apply with a lot of force in this particular area. The enforcement mechanisms with respect to cartels work pretty well. You have the various kinds of snitch rules and you give benefits to one party or another. You don't know exactly what to do in these particular cases. So the stakes are enormous. The informational demands on trying to put the system together are very great. The lumbering nature of the process of an antitrust law is that it takes longer to figure out what the antitrust laws can do than several several generations of technological innovations are going to start to take place. So I agree with David when he says that, we really have to orient the antitrust laws to see that innovation problems are very, very different. And once you do that, I think the orientation is, by and large, speak now, forever hold your peace, but don't think of it. What do you then have to worry about? And I'll just end on this point. Several people have alluded to serious problems that take place with tech companies and so forth. Privacy is obviously one concern. Leaking and sharing data could create national context. But that's not a problem about monopoly power. You could have 5 Twitters, and they could all be deeply competitive, and one of them blows this kind of information. It's going to be a terrible situation, even if everybody else goes the other way around. Or it turns out you have censorship as a serious problem. Well, I feel the same way. I don't want a major problem to platform to be able to censor people in one way or another. I'm very uneasy about all of that. But it seems to me, again, I don't see how the antitrust law solves that problem. The only thing that's going to ease these particular problems, and you hear murmurings of it now, is that somebody will put up a non-Google like Google or a non-Twitter like Twitter, in many cases with a consciously conservative tone about it, in an effort to get rid of the exclusions on the other platform. But as we know, and this I think is the final word, is that network industries are inherently unstable. And when they switch in the grand matter because of the necessity of everybody to be together. And when you have that kind of dynamic instability, it turns out I don't think the antitrust laws give you much purchase one way or another on what to do. We are all kind of little animals on these huge waves, and we just have to learn how to ride them because we're not going to be able to stop them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Richard. I really appreciate that anchoring the first part of the session. We're a little behind, but I think it was worth it. That was my feeling. So it was great content, very interesting listening. Richard, you found something in common with all of us. That's a good way to end and to break.